Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 15th, 1979, a college student by the name of James Dallas Egber III disappeared into a steam tunnel below his university, intending to commit suicide. He was unsuccessful and would be found a few weeks later hiding out at a family member's house. But in the time in between his disappearance and when he was found, his disappearance caused a nationwide panic, and a nationwide moral panic, because the story that emerged about Egber was not that he was a depressed and suicidal young person, but mostly that he was a devotee of fantasy role-playing games, in particular Dungeons and Dragons. And that set off and played into this larger frenzy about what these kinds of games were doing to our cherished youth. So let's talk about the Dungeons and Dragons panic and this larger moment of satanic panic. Here, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Let's start with the person at the heart of this, James Egber III. So much of this story is about the media narrative around him not really acknowledging what was really going on with him. So what is really going on with him? Who is he really? And then we'll talk about the kind of skewed version that goes out into the world.
He was a kid growing up in Dayton, Ohio. The thing to know about him is he was considered a child prodigy. He was so smart. He was so good with technology at just the beginning of this new technological age of computers. And by the time he was 16, he was in college. He was at Michigan State University. He was a computer science major. And he was one of those kids who, very young compared to all the other kids, extremely smart, into this kind of like nerdy, techie thing. And the place where he found community was in science fiction, fantasy, and in this game, Dungeons and Dragons, which at this point had been out for about 5 years, but had become really popular because it was this fantasy role-playing game where you got together with your friends and you came up with stories, and they could be like these really long, involved, intricate games. And kids like Egbert were really into them.
Yeah, but I think he also was like a kid that was deeply troubled and also trying to escape. And so he used, this book series and these games in order to sort of escape the pressures of academics, the pressures of his parents. If you can only imagine being 16 and in college, there's a lot of pressure that goes alongside that probably fueled a lot of his, mental health issues.
Right. There's an element of escapism in this that it's just so clear why he wanted to escape. I mean, people escape into all sorts of things. But by the late 70s, you have these kids, these teenagers escaping into role-playing games. And those things get tangled up with the mental health issues that he had and with his attempted suicide.
Right. And of course, this idea of like, what is this game doing to our kids, and why is it offering them a chance to escape or forge? And that is what, in my mind, adolescence is all about. It's about trying new versions of yourself. But that is at the heart of the sort of fear here, is that this game is enabling my child to become something that they weren't, or that they, and something more sinister. I think the kind of like air of black magic type stuff around Dungeons and Dragons has a little to do with it. It's not just kind of like, here's this thing that my kid is obsessed with and I'm losing my child, but there is a little bit of that kind of like, and that's where it plays into a little the satanic panic, like Dungeons and Dragons itself. If you just don't pay attention to it and just sort of see the surface level, it kind of maybe has a little of that vibe, but also is, I think, at the heart of most of this is just sort of that parental fear and panic that we see about kind of, oh, my children are being seduced and being transformed.
Niki, I feel like you write about this a lot, this sort of moral panic of the evangelical right in terms of like the 70s, 80s, 90s, even 2000s to some extent, of where parents are terrified of like Ouija boards, witchcraft. This is later, but the whole Harry Potter craze, the right was way against that.
We've done video games, which sometimes has a little bit of that.
Yeah. This is early too, but like what's the call, not the Call of Duty, but the other one that comes out where you steal cars. I can't remember.
Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, Grand Theft Auto, like all of these like video games, again, this is a little bit before that, but the terror of that children are going to be influenced by these things and persuaded to either commit acts of crime or to engage in sort of like spiritual, I don't know, witchcraft, had parents in a panic.
There's certainly an angle of this that draws in the religious right. So I don't know if you know what Jack Chick tracts are, but they are these kind of evangelical little booklets that some evangelicals give out for Halloween. They'll like stick them in the kids' trick-or-treat bag, and it tells them why Halloween is like satanic. They have like little chick tracts about Dungeons and Dragons. So there is an element of evangelical Christians who see that there are invocations of demons and other supernatural entities, and that gives it a particular feel. But I do think those moral panics go beyond just the right and evangelical circles. Here you have kids who seem like outcasts who are playing around in this fantasy world, and there's a sense that, oh, maybe they're going to confuse the lines between fantasy and reality, and something is going to go really wrong, and they're going to be drawn into satanic rituals. They're going to become killers. I mean, you see some of the same stuff come up with like the Columbine shooting, right? Yeah. That these are like these outsider weird kids, and the things that they're interested in are going to make them dangerous to society. And that puts this in the sort of long lineage of moral panics about everything from juvenile delinquency in the 1950s to some of the stuff that we're seeing right now.
And we should certainly add like heavy metal music to that list too, as probably one of the key ones that sort of elicits this kind of frenzy. So the frenzy in this case, let's talk about that. So we have Egbert does go into the tunnels below his school, and it looks, he leaves a suicide note. It looks like he's going down there, and then later we learn to attempt suicide. But his family, doesn't know where he is. They hire an investigator to determine their son's whereabouts. And it's really that investigator who I think kind of skews this narrative and maybe plays it up for the media. But one thing that's just sort of wild about this is that when they go to Egbert's room, they find a lot of like D&D stuff and a lot of this kind of trappings of a kid who's into that kind of stuff. They also find one of those like classic, I gather, like push pin map things on the wall. Like it's literally like
like an investigator.
I mean, that's such a cliche at this point, but it's that, and that apparently was the like map of the steam tunnels, which is where they then get this idea that like, oh, he's obsessed with these steam tunnels, and that's where he's gone. And then they go down there and they find other evidence that he'd been there, and then this is where this investigator starts to really kind of like push the narrative in one direction beyond like, oh, here's this depressed kid who went, to this hiding spot to commit suicide, but instead crafts this other narrative that's much more focused on Dungeons and Dragons. So, Niki, you want to tell us a little bit about this guy, William Deere, and what he kind of starts to say to the press in the wake of all of this?
There's such a cinematic quality to this because you can just see like this grizzled old detective walking in and looking at those pushpins and being like, aha, it's in the tunnels. And he's learning a lot about Egbert. And so he learns that Egbert has been having some issues with school, that he has been maybe experimenting with drugs, that he's been depressed, that he's been struggling with his sexuality, that there are all of these things going on. But Deere doesn't want to explain all of that to the press. He wants to keep some of these things private. So he holds some of it back, and he puts forward this idea that, he was involved in Dungeons and Dragons, and maybe that's why he goes down to the tunnels in order to LARP. So that, Dungeons and Dragons is a board game, but you can also do this live action role play where you run around pretending that you are the character that you're playing in the real world. And these tunnels would be perfect for that, right? It would be a real place where you could let your imagination run wild. And so the media sees on that detail, and they begin to write stories that are like, well, maybe he confused reality and his fantasy, and things got out of control at that point. And that puts Dungeons and Dragons at the middle of the reporting instead of these broader issues that Egbert was dealing with.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
to me, it's fascinating that they chose to go down this D&D route as opposed to like his real mental health issues. And I think in some ways, maybe that is a part of the parents as well. I suppose that they like, you never want to see this as like a parenting failure. So if you can point it to something else, like an outside influence, then, it can somehow assuage how you might feel about your child's choices. But what is even more, I think, saddening about this is that he does try to take his own life. He takes, sleeping pills, and he goes to that tunnel, and he's not successful in taking his own life. But that doesn't necessarily deter him.
Right. Well, and that's sort of, obviously there's this narrative. Both the parents are, hyping it up, and the detective is running with it. And I would imagine in part because he sees that the media will eat this up if he sort of talks up to this. Your child is under this spell of this satanic-esque game. But, there's a suicide attempt. There's a suicide note. And I tried to go and find if it had been disclosed. I don't think it was ever, what was in the note was ever out there. Although it's interesting, the first reporting on this, the headline the day after he disappears is "Police Seeking Genius," which is just an interesting little headline for this. But, there's a suicide note. And presumably that suicide note is not like written in the voice of a character that he's become. Right. So I think there was evidence that like, we have a troubled kid, a real kid who's troubled in real ways. And instead it's like, no, that's not it. It's that he's become delusional and become this other character.
Yeah. That's what I find so interesting about these moral panics. I mean, Kellie, you hit on it that there are all these underlying issues, but they're not talking about that. They're talking about this board game. This was one of the defining features of the satanic panic of the 1980s. The issue was child abuse. Yeah. And the answer was child abuse is happening by people that children know by and large. It happens with family members and people in authority, priests, teachers, coaches, but instead it's exoticized. It's turned into like, oh no, it's like these people having these strange satanic rituals and rites, and they're the ones that are hurting our children. And I think you see it's a displacement because people don't want to face the bigger underlying issues. Right.
It's not just we're coming up with a theory because you don't know what happened. It's actually you have pretty good indication of what did happen, and you're still like running away from that. And
Dungeons and Dragons sounds sinister. It sounds like, some sort of like dark game that people can say, this is the problem. And if you get rid of this, then, we don't have to worry about, our children in this way. Yeah. Which is a total cop-out.
Right. So the media really runs with this, no surprise. They run with the D&D angle. And the family is, kind of feeding this and not talking about the other evidence that there is about what's going on with their child. As you said, Kellie, he did indeed attempt suicide in the tunnels on August 15th, Egbert. He woke up and he makes his way to his uncle's home. And while he's there, he's kind of hiding out with his uncle, and he's seeing this like media explosion. And both he and the uncle are kind of like, we just got to lay low. And which I think is, understandable reaction. Of course, what it means is it just festers and festers and festers and explodes and explodes and explodes in the matter of the coming weeks. Over that time, Egbert is sort of hiding out. They move into another spot in Michigan. Eventually, his uncle helps him move to New Orleans. He makes another attempt on his life down there. And he, gets a job. He's just kind of, off the grid. And then eventually gets found and gets interviewed and sort of tells his side of the story.
Yeah, and it continues to be a sad story with Egbert. First of all, it doesn't take away from the panic around Dungeons and Dragons. We'll talk about where that goes. But, Egbert attempts suicide several times, and he attempts suicide a year later and successfully completes it. And so it's a really sad story for Egbert. People continue, though, to focus on Dungeons and Dragons as this occult force that is affecting America's youth. There's this woman, Patricia Pulling, who is an anti-occult campaigner, and she founds an organization against Dungeons and Dragons called BAD. Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons.
Can we pause and
let's sit there for a second?
Sit with that acronym, BADD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons.
Bothered is not strong enough.
No,
word.
but bad is a good.
I mean,
bad is a
even
good.
mad was like, okay, I get mad, but bad. It's just bad.
Yeah,
Slightly
I mean, look, we have
annoyed by
moms.
Drunken
Right.
and Dragons.
Yeah, but like mad.
Well, you
would've been-
can't call it like distraught because that's dad, and then that doesn't work. None of it works.
We have moms. What is it? We have moms for liberty. You could have mothers against Dungeons and Dragons, but I guess mad was already being used.
Mad
or
was
whatever.
taken.
But,
Sad
but
was
anyway.
taken.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's where it becomes this larger thing and feeds into this larger era of panic, as you have, this one mother and this one organization. But as we wrap up, I'm just curious, kind of, when we've talked about other moments like this, these moral panics, there was often a moment where it does become politicized, and we're a political history show, but like for instance the rap music thing, you all of a sudden have hearings in Congress. The video games thing, we've talked about how there's hearings in Congress.
Yeah.
Obviously the current moral panics around what our kids are reading in school is like started probably in the political sphere, but they intersect. Do you get the feeling that this was clearly a media and a cultural and a sort of parental thing? Does it reach that political level? I mean, are there hearings about Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that?
I haven't seen any evidence that there were. I mean, it seems like there was some attention. The National Coalition on TV Violence gets involved, so it sort of blends into some of those other concerns about violence and culture. And on the religious right, there are concerns about occult and culture. But I think there was this really good line by somebody who was interviewed by 60 Minutes. The co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons was interviewed. And he's just like, it's make-believe. Think about like the game of Monopoly. Who is bankrupted by a game of Monopoly? No one is. The money isn't real. It's the same thing. Like the dragons aren't real. It's just a game. And that's kind of his defense. And I think because Dungeons and Dragons was very popular, but it wasn't ubiquitous the way that video games or TV or even like rap music was. And I think that has something to do with it.
Can I just say, I think this quote from Pulling, though, is so wild to me, where she's describing sort of like all of the problems that come from D&D. She says, it's a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, what is it, necromantics, divination, and other teachings. Is it necromantics? What is necromantics?
We'll talk off mic. Yeah. Yes, that's basically it. Yes.
Something about dead people. That's a lot, lady. That's a lot.
Put on the game. Yeah.
It is. To put on the game.
It is. We should say that Pulling's son died by suicide in 1982 when she started this. So again, I think that displacement is at work. That is, by the way, quite a list.
Quite a list.
Never have I ever.
Quite a list. But I think also a way of, again, absconding some sort of responsibility for people's actual mental health and demonizing aspects of society that people, want to see as immoral. There was a way of just sort of like throwing everything out with the bathwater. And I think this game was a way people could use it as a scapegoat to not have to deal with, real issues.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think we will leave it there. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, I don't think this is there was just a massive Dungeons and Dragons movie. I think it's faded away. But even in the last 10 years, in 2010, the U.S. Court of Appeals upheld a ban on D&D in a correctional institution. And the idea being that this would foster inmates' ideas of escapism and alternate realities, which frankly I think
who is it hurting?
Right.
But, I would say largely speaking, this moral panic has faded, only to be replaced, as we've talked about and as many others have chronicled, just sort of every generation, there's a new one that features many of the similar contours. And, we should give shout outs to, there's all sorts of great podcasts out there that sort of dive deeply into this stuff. You're Wrong About has done a lot of stuff. There's a show called American Hysteria, who we're pals with. So, there's plenty of stuff out there if you want to go deeper on this.
And Monsters and Mazes, the book and movie. The movie
right,
starring
so that was Tom
Hanks.
Hanks' first movie, was Monsters and Mazes, and it was inspired a little bit by here. I haven't gotten a sense in the little research I did about that movie about whether what the politics of that movie was. I think it was mostly just about kind of a bunch of kids who were into this kind of stuff, but it wasn't like scaring up the moral panic, I don't think. But clearly it was in this moment. But yeah, Tom Hanks' first movie was inspired by this story. So there you go. All right, we will leave it there. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.